The morning Winifred Leland arrived in Harrow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, she carried nothing but a trunk of good sense, a canvas sack of rose cuttings wrapped in damp cloth, and the particular kind of grief that makes a woman either collapse entirely or become absolutely unbreakable. She had been a widow for 11 months by then. Her husband, Thomas Leland, had died of a fever that came on fast and left no room for goodbyes, not the proper kind anyway. He had been a decent man, a farmer in Missouri who smelled of turned earth and pipe tobacco, and who had loved her quietly and consistently for 6 years of marriage. They had not been a passionate love story, she and Thomas. They had been something steadier than that, something that held its shape in hard weather, and when he was gone she found herself standing in the middle of their Missouri farmhouse with the strange and terrible sensation of being completely untethered from the life she had built. She had sold what she could, packed what mattered, and answered an advertisement in the Harrow Creek Gazette that her cousin Della had mailed her, scrawled along the margins, "Win, they need a school teacher. You always were smarter than anyone gave you credit for." Harrow Creek was a town trying to believe in itself. It sat at the edge of the Edwards Plateau in West Texas, where the land rolled out flat and yellow in every direction, interrupted only by the occasional limestone outcrop, or the long silver thread of a creek that ran low in summer and ran wild in spring. There was a general store, a church with a crooked steeple, a saloon that kept more regular hours than the church, a livery stable, a blacksmith, a land office, and a schoolhouse that needed a teacher badly enough that the town council had put the advertisement in papers as far north as St. Louis. Winifred was 31 years old. She was not a soft woman, not fragile in the way some men preferred their women to be fragile. She was strong in the shoulders from years of farm work, steady in the eyes, and possessed of a practical mind that had gotten her through the worst of the past year. She wore her dark hair pinned up sensibly, and she wore dresses that allowed her to work, and she had opinions that she had learned, over the years, to measure carefully before voicing in the company of men who did not like being measured in return. The land the town had arranged for her was a small house on the edge of town. It sat along a dirt road that ran north-south, and her property line met the western boundary of Clayton Sheridan's land at a long wooden fence, 4 rails of split cedar that had gone silver-gray with weather. The fence was in good repair. That was the first thing she noticed about the man who owned the land on the other side of it before she had ever laid eyes on him. He maintained his fences. That told you something. What she saw beyond that fence was flat working land. A proper cattle operation, not enormous but run tight. There were maybe 200 head of longhorns grazing in the far pasture, a good barn, a bunkhouse for the 3 hands he kept, a windmill that turned steadily in the afternoon breeze, and a house that was clean and square and utterly without decoration. No flower beds, no porch plants, not a single thing planted within 50 feet of that house that was not either edible or structural. It was the property of a man who had considered beauty once, found it unnecessary, and moved on. She was told his name by Mrs. Alma Boatwright, the postmistress, who told her everything she needed to know about everyone in Harrow Creek within the first 20 minutes of her arrival, in the efficient and thorough manner of a woman who considered information a civic service. "Clayton Sheridan," Alma said, handing Winifred a set of brass keys to the schoolhouse. "He is 34 years old, never been married, runs cattle on about 200 acres east of your place, does not attend church but does pay his taxes, and he is the most determinedly unneighborly man in this county, though not unkind. He just does not particularly want company. His father built that spread and left it to him. He has had it 12 years, and in 12 years he has added to the acreage and improved the cattle stock, and never once done a thing that was not directly useful to the running of the ranch." "He sounds efficient," Winifred said. "He sounds lonely," Alma replied, with the bluntness of a woman who had delivered enough mail to know the difference. Winifred moved into her little house on a Thursday. By Saturday she had scrubbed the floors, repaired a window latch, learned which floorboard squeaked, and assessed her fence line with the focused attention of a woman who had been carrying rose cuttings wrapped in damp cloth across 300 miles and was not about to let them die before they were planted. The fence line ran about 100 yards along the east side of her property. The soil along it was poor but workable. She got a spade from the general store, a bag of good composted manure from the livery stable. Mr. Hector Gill, the liveryman, was a generous man when it came to manure, and she spent the whole of that first Saturday digging a long planting bed along the base of the fence, turning the soil, working the compost in, and then setting her cuttings at careful intervals. Damask roses mostly, the kind her mother had grown in Kentucky. They were old-fashioned plants, deep-rooted, stubborn, bred for surviving neglect and rewarding care in equal measure. She planted 12 of them. She watered each one from the pump at the back of her house, hauling the bucket the distance to the fence line with the patient efficiency of someone who understood that important things sometimes require a great deal of unglamorous effort. She staked each cutting, pressed the soil firm at each base, and when she straightened up and looked down the length of the fence, sweating in the late afternoon Texas sun with her hands dark with soil, she felt something she had not felt in nearly a year. She felt purposeful. She did not meet Clayton Sheridan that first week. She caught a glimpse of him crossing between his barn and his house on her second day, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a weathered hat who moved with the deliberate economy of someone who never wasted a step. He did not look in her direction. She did not call out. She went about her business and he went about his. The school term began on a Monday in late April. She had 23 students ranging from 6 to 15 years of age, the children of ranchers and farmers and merchants, and one set of twin boys whose father was the town drunk, and who came to school in clothes that needed mending, but who were bright as buttons and hungry for every word she put on the blackboard. She loved the work immediately and completely. She was a natural teacher, clear, patient, demanding enough to keep bright minds occupied and gentle enough to bring the slower ones along. Within 2 weeks, the school board, which had been nervous about hiring a widow from Missouri who had no formal teaching certificate, was congratulating itself on its own good judgment. She fell into the rhythm of the place. Morning at school, afternoon at home, evenings reading or mending or working in her garden. She was not unhappy. She was careful about that word with herself, unhappy, because she had been through enough to know the difference between unhappiness and the necessary quiet of rebuilding. She was rebuilding. It was going well. The roses, against all reasonable expectation given the poor soil and the relentless Texas heat, began to take. She noticed the first green shoots on a morning in early May, coming out to check on them before school. 3 of the 12 had put up new growth, small and tentative but unmistakably alive. She crouched at the fence line in her good dress and looked at those shoots with a feeling that she could not quite name, something between gratitude and vindication. She had not seen Clayton Sheridan any closer than 50 yards. She had heard him, occasionally, the sound of him working in his barn, the low voice he used when talking to his horses, the occasional short exchange with his ranch hands, a man named Amos Pruitt who had worked for Clayton for 7 years, and a pair of younger cowboys named Cleet and Davis who were brothers from somewhere in the hill country. She had begun to form a picture of him from these fragments, the way you form a picture of weather from sounds before you step outside. Then he rode past on his big roan horse on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of May, coming along the road at a walk, and he slowed when he saw her kneeling at the fence line with a watering can, and for the first time they were in the same space close enough for actual human conversation. He looked at the fence line. He looked at her. "You planted something along the fence," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and deliberate, the voice of a man who chose his words without particular hurry. "Roses," she said. She stood, brushing the knees of her dress. "I am Winifred Leland. I am the new school teacher." "I know who you are," he said. "Clayton Sheridan." He touched the brim of his hat briefly. "Those roots will pull water away from the fence posts." She looked at him with the patient expression she used on children who stated incorrect facts with great confidence. "The roots will grow toward the fence posts, not away from them," she said pleasantly. "Cedar roots are the ones that drink deeply enough to threaten fence structures. Rose roots are shallow and lateral. They will not disturb your fence." There was a pause. He looked at the planted line, then back at her, with the expression of a man recalculating. "All right," he said. He did not apologize, but there was something in the simplicity of his acknowledgement that she found unexpectedly decent. Some men would have doubled down on being wrong. He just accepted it and moved on. "You are on the right side of the fence," he added, meaning her plants were on her side of the property line. "I am aware," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, with the careful attention of a man who did not usually give careful attention to anything except land and livestock. Then he clicked to his horse and rode on. She watched him go, aware that she was watching him, aware that it was perhaps the first time in 11 months she had watched anyone with anything other than practical assessment. She turned back to her roses. She told herself it meant nothing. It meant almost nothing. It meant very little. It meant something. Through the rest of May, she saw him in the usual way of neighbors who are aware of each other, without exactly seeking each other out, glimpses across the fence line. The sound of him working at dawn before she was properly awake. The silhouette of him against the evening sky when she sat on her porch after supper. Once she saw him pull a calf from a bog near the creek single-handedly, wading into his knees in the mud with a calm, methodical competence that was somehow more impressive than any dramatic display of strength would have been. She watched from a distance, and he did not know she watched, and she felt slightly embarrassed about watching but not embarrassed enough to stop. The roses bloomed for the first time in early June. Not all 12, only 4 of them, the 4 strongest, the ones that had put up those first brave shoots back in May. They came out deep red and full-petaled in the way of old damask roses, with a scent that in the evening breeze could reach all the way to her porch and probably, she imagined, could reach across the fence line to where his barn stood quiet in the dusk. She saw him notice them on a Sunday morning. She was coming back from church. He was never at church. And as she came up the road, she saw him standing on his side of the fence, not quite at the fence, maybe 8 feet back from it, looking at the blooms. He stood there for a long moment with his hat in his hand, and there was something in his posture that she could not entirely read, not displeasure, not the blankness of someone seeing something neutral, something else, something that looked almost like a man being surprised by something he had not expected to be surprised by. When he heard her footsteps, he put his hat back on and walked toward his barn without looking at her. She smiled to herself and did not say anything. The following Thursday she baked a pie. Blackberry, from the wild berries that grew along the creek, that she had picked on Saturday with Mrs. Boatwright's daughter Lily, who was one of her students and who was 11 years old and knew the best spots. She baked 2 pies. She ate one herself over the course of the week. She took the other one, covered in a clean cloth, and set it on Clayton Sheridan's porch rail while he was out riding his range, with a small note that said, "From your neighbor. The blackberries are very good this year." She did not know why she did it exactly. Neighborliness was part of it. The same impulse that made people in farming communities look after one another. Because the land was hard, and isolation was harder, and small kindnesses were the mortar between the stones of any community worth the name. That was part of it. It was not all of it. She was back in her own house by the time he rode in that evening. She did not watch for his reaction from her window, or not for very long. She heard him come in, heard the particular creak of his porch step. She had learned the sounds of his place the way you learn the sounds of something you live near, and then silence. He came to her door on Saturday morning. She heard the knock and smoothed her hair and told herself to breathe normally, which was an instruction she would not have needed to give herself a month ago, and she opened the door. He was standing there with his hat in his hand, holding the empty pie dish. His hair was darker than it looked from a distance, and his eyes were gray-green, the color of the sage that grew along the creek banks. There was a scar along his jaw that she had not been able to see from across the fence, a small one, well-healed, that suggested at some history she did not yet know. "Good pie," he said. "Thank you." He held out the dish. "I am glad you enjoyed it," she said, taking the dish. She noticed that he had washed it, not a man who returned things dirty. Another small note in the ledger she was keeping without quite deciding to keep it. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" He hesitated. Not long, but she noticed the hesitation, a man who was not accustomed to casual social invitations, turning the option over as if checking it for weight and risk. "I have a fence post that is working loose on the south pasture," he said. Not a refusal exactly, more like a man explaining the competing demands on his time. "I am not asking you to stay long," she said. "Just coffee." He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the way the surface of water shifts before a stone breaks it. "All right," he said. "Coffee." She had a small parlor with a table and 4 chairs and a window that looked out on the garden. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she had made that morning and set them on the table, and they sat across from each other with the slightly formal attention of 2 people who are trying to figure out how much ease is appropriate to the moment. "How long have you had the ranch?" she asked. 12 years, he said. "My father built the house. I have added to it since." "It is well kept," she said. "Efficiency matters more than appearance," he said, with the straightforwardness of a man stating a principle he had lived by long enough that he no longer questioned it. "Can something not be both?" she asked. He considered this. He was not a man who dismissed questions that she could already tell. He turned them over and took them seriously even when his answer was going to be simple. "I suppose," he said, "but the efficiency comes first. The rest is extra." "My roses might disagree with you on that," she said. He looked at her. There was something in the way he looked at her when she pushed back on an idea, a sharpness, an alertness, like a man whose attention had been genuinely caught. "Your roses are on your side of the fence," he said. "They are," she agreed, smiling, "and they bloom anyway." He drank his coffee. He did not say much, but he was not uncomfortable with silence the way some men were. He looked around the room with the calm inventory of a man who was used to assessing things, and when his eyes landed on the row of books she had arranged on the small shelf by the fireplace, he paused. "You have a lot of books," he said. "I am a teacher," she said. "Books are equipment." "What do you teach from?" "McGuffey readers for the youngest, arithmetic, geography, history. The older ones we do some literature. I have been reading them some Tennyson." "Does Tennyson help them run cattle?" he asked. Not mockingly. She watched his face carefully, but genuinely curious, in the blunt way of a man who wanted to understand the practical application of things. "Tennyson helps them understand themselves," she said, "which may matter just as much as running cattle when you get to the end of things." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father could read. My mother could not. She learned after they were married. He taught her." It was the most personal thing he had said. She could tell by the slight shift in his voice that he had not entirely planned to say it, and that he was not entirely sure why he had. "That is a beautiful thing," she said simply, not making more of it than it was. He stood up. "I appreciate the coffee," he said. He put on his hat and nodded and went back across the fence line to his efficient, undecorated, well-maintained life. But he went across the fence line differently than he had come. She could see it in his walk. Not much, just something fractionally less closed than before. June passed, and July came on with the full ferocity of a Texas summer, brutal and bright and smelling of dust and hot cedar. Winifred kept school running through early July and then dismissed for a 6-week break, which she used to visit Della in San Antonio for 2 weeks, fix several things in her house that needed fixing, and tend her roses, which needed more water in the heat, and got it. She and Clayton had settled into a pattern of nodding acknowledgement across the fence line and occasional brief conversations when they happened to be at the fence at the same time. She learned things about him in fragments. He had grown up on this land. He had a brother in Colorado he did not see often. He had lost his mother when he was 19. He read, though not widely practical books, ranching manuals, the newspaper. He cooked his own food with the same pragmatic competence he applied to everything else and ate what was fuel rather than pleasure. She brought him things. She could not entirely explain this compulsion, except that she was a woman who expressed care through tangible acts, who had learned early that saying you cared about someone was the easiest part, and the doing of it was where the truth lived. She brought him bread when she baked. She brought him medicinal herbs when one of his hands, Amos, went down with a chest cold that rattled in a way she found alarming, and she came over herself and made a poultice, and told Amos in a voice that brooked no argument that he was to rest and drink liquids and not get back on a horse until the rattle was gone. Clayton had stood in the doorway of the bunkhouse and watched her take charge of his ranch hand, with an expression she had come to think of as his surprised expression, that slight loosening around the eyes that happened when something circumvented his expectations. Amos recovered in 4 days. He told Clayton he thought Ms. Leland was the best thing that had happened to this part of Texas since the railroad came through, which was not accurate geographically since the railroad ran 30 miles south. But Amos was not a man who let facts interfere with appreciation. It was in late July that Clayton Sheridan did a thing that Winifred Leland did not discover until the following spring, but which his ranch hand Clayton witnessed and reported to his brother Davis, who mentioned it quietly to Amos, who was discretion itself, and said nothing to anyone for nearly 8 months. What happened was this. There was a night in late July when a thunderstorm came through with the wild, sideways violence of a Texas summer storm, lightning and hard rain and wind that bent the mesquite trees horizontal. The storm knocked 2 sections of Clayton's fence, the fence that ran along the property line, where Winifred's roses grew. It knocked them flat. It drove a fence rail across 3 rose plants and broke them nearly at the root. In the morning, Clayton walked his fence line, which he always did after a storm, assessing damage. He saw the fence sections down. He saw the rose plants. He stood there for a long time. Then he went to the barn and got his tools, and he fixed the fence with the efficiency and care he gave to all his maintenance tasks. But he fixed it from the far side, his side, so that he had to work around the rose plants rather than pulling them clear. He was careful with them. He set the broken stems back in position and pressed the soil firm around them, and he did not say anything to anyone about any of it. 2 of those 3 plants recovered. The 3rd one did not, but 2 did. Winifred did not know this yet. She came home from San Antonio in early August to find her roses somewhat battered from the storm and the fence repaired, and she noted the repaired fence with the same quiet approval she had felt the first day she arrived and seen that his fences were maintained, and she tended the battered plants back to health and did not know that he had worked carefully around them in the storm's aftermath. She found out from Amos in March of the following year, but that is a later part of the story. The school term resumed in September. The leaves on the cottonwood trees along the creek went yellow and gold. The heat broke in October and the air turned clean and cool, and the Edwards Plateau in fall had a spare, particular beauty. The silver grass and the dark cedar, and the wide sky going pink and orange at evening. Winifred walked to school and back each day, and loved the country in that season with the uncomplicated love of someone who has found a place that suits them without trying to. She and Clayton had supper together for the first time in October. This was her doing. She invited him directly, on a Tuesday evening when she ran into him at the general store, and decided that the careful dance of near conversations across fence lines had gone on long enough, and that she was 31 years old and a practical woman, and there was no reason a widow, and her neighbor could not share a meal without it requiring more ceremony than it was worth. She cooked roast beef and potatoes and corn bread, and a dried apple cake that her mother had taught her to make. He came at the appointed time in a clean shirt, which was the most significant information of the evening. Not that he had dressed to come, which any person of basic manners would do, but that the clean shirt was clearly his best one and he had pressed it, and the pressing of it told her more than he probably meant to tell. They ate and they talked, and this time the conversation opened up further than it had in those earlier, shorter exchanges. He told her about the winter of 1877, the year after he had taken full ownership of the ranch, when a late blizzard had killed 40 head of cattle and nearly ruined him, and how he had spent the following 3 years rebuilding the herd with a focused, grinding determination that left room for very little else. She understood, listening to him, the arithmetic of how a man becomes the way he is. The ranch had taken everything he had to give for years on end, and what was left over had been practical enough to survive, and nothing that did not serve survival had been cultivated. She told him about Thomas. Not all of it, not the deep private grief that she still carried in the small hours of nights when it got quiet, but the facts of it, the shape of her life before, the reason she had come west. He listened to her the way he did everything without interrupting, without offering easy condolences she had not asked for, with the simple, attentive quality of a man who was actually hearing rather than just waiting for his turn to speak. "Do you miss Missouri?" he asked. "I miss the person I was when I was there," she said honestly. "I was younger. I had not lost anyone yet. That is a way of being in the world that you do not know you will miss until it is gone." She paused. "But Harrow Creek suits me. The land suits me. I think I was meant for more room than Missouri had." He looked at her across the supper table with those gray-green eyes and said nothing for a moment and then said, "The land here will test you." "I know," she said. "That is part of why it suits me." He walked home after supper in the cool October dark, and she stood on her porch and watched him cross the fence line, and something in her chest was warm in a way that was entirely separate from the fire she had built against the evening chill. November came. He helped her repair a loose board in her porch without being asked. He simply saw it was loose one morning when he was riding past and came over that afternoon with a hammer and nails, and fixed it in about 7 minutes while she brought him coffee and did not make a production of it, because they were both, she was learning, people who express things through the quiet language of action rather than elaborate speech. She brought him medicines from the apothecary when he mentioned in passing that he had a persistent headache that had been bothering him for a week. He thanked her in the brief, direct way he thanked her for everything, which was once and sincerely and without embellishment, which she had come to understand was not terseness, but rather the opposite. It was the sign of a man for whom a sincere word was worth more than a dozen performed ones. November was also when Harrow Creek had its annual social, which was held in the church hall and constituted the social event of the season, dancing and food, and the whole community together in a way that happened only a few times a year. Everyone went. Mrs. Boatwright told Winifred about it with the particular expectant quality of a woman who thought it would be interesting if Winifred attended with a certain neighbor, and did not quite say so, but left enough space around the idea for the suggestion to be perfectly clear. Winifred did not directly ask Clayton to accompany her to the social. What she did was mention it in conversation, note that she was going, and leave a pause. He looked at her during that pause with the expression of a man doing rapid internal calculation. "I do not usually attend those things," he said. "I know," she said. "I thought you might make an exception." Another pause, longer this time. "I suppose a neighbor ought to escort a widow to a social," he said, which was the most indirect way of agreeing she had ever heard, and which made her want to laugh out loud, though she kept her face pleasantly neutral. "That would be very neighborly," she agreed. He came to her door on the evening of the social in his pressed shirt and his good hat, and she was wearing a green wool dress she had bought in San Antonio and had been saving for the right occasion. He looked at her when she opened the door with a stillness that was different from his usual considered pauses, the stillness of a man who had been pulled up short by something and was working out what to do about it. "You look fine," he said, which was his version of something much more elaborate. "Thank you," she said. "You look well yourself." They walked together along the road to the church hall, close enough that their arms nearly touched in the dark, and she could feel the warmth of him beside her, could feel that the distance between them was measuring itself in a new and different way. The church hall was full of lantern light and fiddle music, and the particular smell of community food and wood smoke, and the collective body heat of a couple hundred people who worked hard and played hard, and were glad of the occasion for both. Winifred knew half the room by name from school. The parents of her students greeted her warmly, with the particular appreciation of people whose children came home each day with new knowledge. She moved through the room easily because she was good with people and comfortable in company, and Clayton moved with her, slightly behind, slightly to her side, like a man who is unsure of the territory but has decided to trust his guide. He did not dance. She danced 2 dances with Mr. Boatwright, who was a vigorous and not entirely accurate dancer, but clearly enjoyed himself immensely, and one with Amos, who was surprisingly graceful and danced with the contained dignity of a man who understood that quality counted more than quantity. She watched Clayton from the floor. He was standing near the wall with a cup of cider, watching the room with his usual inventory expression. But when his eyes found her in the dancing crowd, something changed in them that she caught across the distance and held briefly before the dance swept her away. Afterward, walking home in the cold November dark, he said, "You are good with people." "It is part of the work," she said. "It is more than the work," he said. "You genuinely like them." "I do," she said. "I like people, even the difficult ones." She glanced at him sideways. She saw his jaw shift in the way that she had come to recognize meant he was suppressing something, not quite a smile, a man who had forgotten how to let a smile all the way out. "Are you suggesting I am one of the difficult ones?" he said. "I would not dream of suggesting anything," she said primly. "I am only saying that I like you." The silence that followed was different from his usual considered silences. It was warmer and more uncertain and human in a way that the others had not been, and she heard him breathe in the cold air, and she waited. "I am not accustomed to that," he said finally. "Being liked," she said. "Being told," he said. She looked at him in the dark. "Then I will keep telling you," she said, "until you get used to it." She went inside and he crossed the fence line, and the night held its shape around them complete. December in Harrow Creek was cold and quiet, and the days were short, and the sky was wide and gray. She gave the children a Christmas celebration at the school, paper chains and carols and small gifts, and closed the term on the Friday before Christmas. She spent Christmas Day with Mrs. Boatwright's family, who had 7 children and a generous table, and a capacity for noise and warmth that she found deeply restorative. She brought Clayton Sheridan a Christmas gift. This was, she knew, a step of a certain weight, a step taken with full awareness of what it might mean or not mean. She had thought carefully about what to give a man who valued utility. She gave him a fine leather journal, the kind used for ranch records, and a good quality pen, and inside the front cover she wrote in her clear teacher's hand, "For the things worth keeping." He came to her door the next morning with a package wrapped in brown paper, which he held with the slightly awkward formality of a man who did not give gifts often. Inside was a pair of good leather work gloves, made to measure. She understood later that he had traced his hand around one of her old worn-out gloves that he must have seen hanging on her porch. They were beautiful, practical and beautiful, which was, she thought, the most Clayton Sheridan thing in the world. "So your hands do not suffer for the gardening," he said. She put them on. "They fit perfectly." She stood there in her doorway with those perfect gloves on her hands and felt something in her chest complete itself, like the last key in a lock. "Clayton," she said. "Winifred," he said. They stood there for a moment with all the accumulated weight of 6 months between them. The fence line and the roses and the pie dish and the coffee and the pressed shirts and the pale November social and the Christmas gifts and all the conversations and all the silences that had been full of something neither of them had said yet. "Come inside," she said. "I made gingerbread." He came inside. He stayed for 3 hours, which was the longest he had stayed at her house, and they talked about his father and her mother, and the difference between Missouri and Texas, and whether Tennyson's poems were better read aloud or on the page, and he had a position on this. He thought aloud, emphatically, because words needed air, and she agreed with him though she would not have predicted she would, and the fire burned down in the hearth, and they both noticed at the same moment and both laughed. Which was the first time she had heard him laugh, fully and without suppressing it, and it was a very good laugh, low and genuine and a little surprised at itself. After that, the boundary between neighborly kindness and something more intentional became impossible to pretend about, for either of them. January 1883 was cold and honest. He helped her when her water pump froze. She brought him soup when he got a cold that laid him low for 4 days, and she sat with him on his porch when he was well enough to be up, and they looked out at the bare winter land together in the particular companionable quiet of two people who have stopped needing to fill silence. His ranch hands noticed. Amos said nothing. Cleet and Davis, who were younger and less tactful, exchanged significant looks whenever Ms. Leland appeared at the property with any delivery whatsoever, until Clayton told them in his flattest voice to attend to their work, at which point they attended to their work with great visible enthusiasm and only very small smiles. She noticed things about him that 6 months ago she would not have had the material to notice. She noticed that he was harder on himself than on anyone else, that the standard he held his own work to was severe in a way that suggested a man who had been told, at some important juncture, that he needed to justify his place in things. She noticed that he was genuinely kind to his horses in a private, unperformed way. The way he spoke to them when he thought no one was listening, low and steady, was the way you spoke to something you had real regard for. She noticed that when he found something genuinely funny, he looked away before he let himself laugh, as if laughter required a privacy he had not yet entirely given up. She noticed that he had not once looked at her roses except carefully, and that she had never once found a bloom disturbed. In February, she heard the full story of the storm from Amos. She had gone over to bring Clayton a jar of preserved peaches, and Clayton had been out on the south pasture, and Amos was at the barn, and they got to talking in the easy way she and Amos had fallen into, and he mentioned it without entirely meaning to, or perhaps he mentioned it very much on purpose, because Amos was a wiser man than he let on. "You know," Amos said, as though it were idle conversation, "after that storm last July when the fence came down, he worked around those rose plants of yours for the better part of a morning, careful as a surgeon, could have cleared them out of the way and it would have been half the work. He did not." She stood very still with her jar of peaches. "He did not say anything about it," she said. "He said nothing to me," Amos said, "but I watched. He set the broke stems back in the ground after, pressed the soil around them nice. He looked at her with the mild, clear eyes of a man who knew exactly what he was saying and was comfortable with it. Thought you might want to know." She walked back to her house and sat down at her kitchen table and held the knowledge for a while, the way you hold something valuable while you figure out where to put it. A man who had decided, perhaps without even fully realizing it, that her roses were worth being careful around. A man who had never once considered beauty useful and had yet, quietly and without announcement, preserved it. She thought about it all through February, which gave her enough time to understand what she was feeling and to decide what she intended to do about it, which was what she always did. She took her time being certain, and then she acted. March came in like a lion, as they said, with cold wind and the smell of rain. The roses were showing their early growth again, the first green of the season, tentative and determined in equal measure. She went to his fence line, not her side but his, which she had not done before, and she waited until he came out of his barn in the morning, and she looked at him across the distance and she said, "I know about the storm." He stopped. He looked at her. His expression did not change much, but his whole bearing shifted, the way a man shifts when something he had kept private is no longer private, and he was deciding what to do about that. Amos, he said. Amos, she confirmed. Clayton. Why did you not tell me? He walked toward her slowly, covering the distance between them, and he stopped on his side of the fence a few feet from her, close enough that she could read every small thing in his face. It was not a remarkable thing, he said. The fence was my fence. I was fixing my fence. You were careful with them, she said. They were growing, he said. You planted them. She looked at him, at this man who had spent 12 years making every inch of his land efficient and useful, and who had, in the early morning after a summer storm, bent carefully around a row of roses because they were growing, and she had planted them. Clayton, she said quietly, I have something I want to say, and I want you to let me say it without interrupting. He looked at her. He nodded once. I came here grieving and alone, and I planted those roses because I needed something beautiful to tend to, she said. I planted them because beauty is not extra, not to me. It is as necessary as food and water. And I have watched you these past months, and I have come to care for you in a way that I did not look for and did not plan, and that I am not, at 31 years of age and in full possession of my faculties, inclined to pretend I do not feel. I am telling you plainly because you are a plain-speaking man and because I have found that plainness between people who care for each other is its own kind of beauty. She stopped. She waited. He was quiet for a long time. A crow called from the cottonwood along the creek. The wind moved through the young mesquite. I have not known many people, he said slowly, who look at a piece of worn-out fence-lined soil and see roses. Most people can learn to see roses, she said, if someone shows them. You have been showing me, he said. Since the day you got here, she held his gaze, I know. He reached out and his hand found hers across the fence rail, and he held it with the careful, steady grip of a man who was holding something important and knew it. I am not a smooth man, he said. I am not easy company. I am at my best in a barn at 5 in the morning and at my worst at church socials, and I am told I am difficult, and I believe it because the evidence supports it. I find you one of the easiest people I know, she said honestly, and I know a great many people. He looked at that for a moment, turned it over. Winifred, he said, and the way he said her name was entirely different from every other time he had said it, fuller, like a door opening rather than a word closing. I would very much like to court you properly. I thought you would never ask, she said, which was a small lie because she had been fairly confident he would eventually ask. But it was the kind of small lie that was kinder than the truth, and he seemed to understand this because that suppressed near smile moved across his face, and this time he let it out. They stood at the fence with their hands together and the roses growing up between them, green and new and persistent, and the Texas sky was wide and blue and full of everything. The courtship that followed was, like the man himself, practical and genuine and possessed of a depth that was not obvious on the surface. He was not a man for flowery speeches or theatrical gestures. What he was, it turned out, was a man who paid attention. He fixed things before she asked. He showed up when something was hard. He listened with his full attention and remembered everything she said, which she found startling and then deeply moving, to be remembered wholly by someone who heard every word. He took her riding in April on a Sunday, not the short, dutiful kind of ride, but a long one, out across the plateau to a limestone outcrop she had not yet found that looked west over 20 miles of flat country with the afternoon sun turning everything gold and amber. They sat on the rock with their horses ground-tied below, and she looked at the view and felt the particular silence of large landscapes, and he was beside her, close, their shoulders touching. My father used to bring my mother here, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the view. When I was a boy, he said. They would ride out here on Sunday afternoons, and I would come along and they would sit on this rock and talk for a while, and then we would ride back. I do not know what they talked about. I was young, but I remember the way they sat together, like they were the only two people in the country. She looked at him in profile, at the strong line of his jaw and the gray-green eyes catching the last of the afternoon light, and understood that he had brought her to this place with intention, and that the intention was both deliberate and also barely containable, and she felt her own heart doing something undignified and wonderful. "Clayton," she said. "Winifred," he said, and turned to look at her. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had thought carefully about whether to do this thing, and having decided was entirely committed to the doing of it, and it was warm and certain and tasted of the coffee they had drunk before they rode out, and it was, she thought, exactly right. Exactly him. When they separated, she looked at the view for a moment because she needed a moment. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed, and she felt the rumble of that in his voice beside her. They rode home in the golden evening, and he kept his horse beside hers, and their knees nearly touched in the road, and she felt so thoroughly alive that she laughed once, out loud, for no particular reason, and he looked at her and let himself smile all the way. May brought the roses into full bloom again, the second year of them, and this year all 12 had survived, and all 12 bloomed, great full-petaled deep red flowers that glowed in the evening light and sent their scent across both sides of the fence line. She was on her porch one evening when she saw Clayton come out of his barn and walk slowly toward the fence and stop and look at the roses in the last of the day's light. She watched him from her chair with her book in her lap, not reading. He stood there for a long time, and she understood something watching him that she had understood in pieces, but now all at once. That beauty had not been something he had never considered. It had been something he had decided to protect himself from, at some point in all those grinding, difficult years, because beauty was what you loved and what you could lose. He was standing at his fence looking at roses that he had never pulled, not once, and she thought, he is learning. She was courted, and she courted in return because she was not a passive woman and saw no reason to be. She taught him Tennyson on her porch in the summer evenings, reading aloud because he had said words needed air, and she watched him listen with his eyes closed sometimes. This man who had not been given much that was extra, receiving it. She brought him to her classroom on a Saturday in June and showed him her students' work on the walls, their letters and their drawings and their arithmetic, and watched his face as he moved through the room reading the evidence of small minds working hard, and something genuine moved through him. "You are doing something real here," he said. "That is all I have ever wanted to do," she said. He brought her a mare in July, a bay with kind eyes and a smooth gait, from a rancher in the next county who was selling down his herd. She was already a competent rider, but the bay was better than the horse she had been renting from the livery, and he had gone and got her without saying so, just presented her with the lead rope one morning with the brief explanation. Better than renting Gil's old gray. She put her hand on the mare's nose and looked at Clayton Sheridan over the horse's neck. "You are not as ungenerous as you would like everyone to believe," she said. "Do not spread that around," he said. She laughed, and he looked at her laughing and the particular helpless quality of his expression in that moment. A man fully in the grip of something he had not originally intended and had entirely given up resisting, told her everything she needed to know about where they were and where they were going. The question of where they were going was answered on an evening in August, when he came to her door after supper with his hat in his hand, the same posture as the day he had returned the pie dish. The first time he had come to her door, but different in every essential way, and asked her to marry him. He asked her with the directness that was the language of everything he did. He said he loved her, which were 3 words he had clearly arrived at through significant internal work, and delivered with a weight that made each of them count for far more than 3 words usually did. He said he could not offer her very much that was graceful or eloquent, and he said the ranch was hers equally if she would take it, and he would build onto the house to give her proper room for her books, and that he would not pull her roses. That last part. She heard it, and she looked at him, this man who had never once pulled a single one, who had fixed a fence around them in the aftermath of a storm in the dark of an early morning and said nothing about it, and she felt something so large and complete in her chest that she stood very still for a moment holding it. "I know," she said. "I know you would not." "Will you?" he said. "Yes," she said. Of course, yes. He put his hat on the porch rail and stepped forward and took her face in his hands and kissed her the way a man kisses someone when the word yes is still warm in the air. And she put her hands on his chest and felt his heart going hard beneath her palms and knew it matched her own. They were married in October of 1883 in the church with the crooked steeple, and most of Harrow Creek came because most of Harrow Creek had been watching this unfold with the satisfied investment of a community that likes a good story and knows one when it sees it. Mrs. Boatwright wept openly and did not apologize for it. Amos stood beside Clayton as his witness, steady and dignified. The twin boys whose father drank too much, now 2 years into their education, were there in their best clothes which Winifred had quietly made for them after they outgrew their old ones, and they sat in the front row and watched everything with the solemn attention of boys who understood they were seeing something important. The ceremony was simple. The preacher read the words. Clayton said "I do" in the same flat certain tone he used for every significant thing, and Winifred said it in the clear voice she used at the front of the classroom, and they put the rings on plain gold bands, the kind that lasts, and it was done. The reception was in the church hall again, lantern light and fiddle music, and this time Clayton danced. Not well. He danced with the careful application of a man learning a new skill he had decided was worth learning, which meant he was focused and slightly stiff and utterly committed to it. And he danced with Winifred in the middle of the hall while the fiddles played, and she followed his lead and laughed when he stepped on her foot, and he looked so earnestly mortified that she pulled him closer and told him he was doing beautifully, which was a lie, but the beautiful kind. They went home to his ranch, their ranch, and she had moved her things over the previous week, the books and the rose cuttings she had divided to make new plantings near the house, and her mother's quilt and the good leather work gloves he had made her for Christmas. The house was the same as it had always been, clean and square and efficient. But there were roses now along the west wall where she had planted cuttings in September, and her books were on new shelves he had built in the parlor with the particular care he gave to things he was building for her. And the journal she had given him for Christmas the year before, filled now with ranch records and, in his careful angular handwriting, other things. She had seen a line once when she passed and had looked away quickly, but she had seen. Best view in the county is from my own kitchen door. She understood what had changed in him and what had not. He was still himself, still practical, still direct, still most at ease in a barn at 5 in the morning. He still ran the ranch with the focused efficiency that had held it together through hard years. He still did not waste words when one would do. He still got up before sunrise and came in after dark and held his own work to a standard that left little room for anything that was not essential. But he had learned, was learning, in the ongoing way that real change works, that some things are essential that do not look it at first. That a row of roses along a fence line is not decoration, but a declaration. That a woman who plants things in poor soil and stands over them with a watering can in the Texas heat is telling you something important about the kind of person she is. That you can spend 12 years making yourself hard against all the things that can be lost, and then a widow can come to the property next door and show you what you have been protecting yourself from was not threat but grace. In the spring of 1884, Winifred found out she was carrying their first child. She told Clayton on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table over coffee, directly and without ceremony, because that was how they spoke to each other, and he sat very still for a moment, and then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it and said nothing for a while and then said, "I will have to enlarge the house." "You will have time," she said, smiling. "I will start next week," he said, because he was a man who did not wait on things once they were decided. He built a room on the north side of the house over the spring and summer, a proper nursery that he built with the same care he gave to the barn, which was to say very careful, every joint tight and every board true, and he put a window in it that faced east where it would catch the morning light. She watched him work on it in the evenings after supper and brought him water and sometimes just sat nearby. And the comfortable quality of being near each other, without needing anything particular from the nearness, had deepened into something so settled and warm it was like standing in full sun. Their son was born in November of 1884. They named him William, after Clayton's father, which had been Clayton's quiet suggestion, and which she had received with the understanding of what it meant for a man to put the name of the person he had most admired on the child he most loved. William Sheridan was born in the early morning hours, brought into the world with the assistance of the midwife, Mrs. Frey, who had delivered half the children in Harrow Creek. He was a robust baby with a fine pair of lungs and his father's gray-green eyes, though at that age all eyes were uncertain, and she might have been imagining the color. Clayton held him in the morning light by the east window of the nursery, with an expression she had never seen on him before, not quite any of the expressions she had catalogued over the past 2 years, something entirely new, something that was wonder stripped of every defense. "Hello," he said to the baby, just that, hello, in his low, careful voice. Winifred was in the bed and could see them both in the morning light, and she held that image in herself like a lamp. William grew in the way babies grow, which is to say all at once and constantly. He was a cheerful child, curious and interested in everything, and Clayton took to fatherhood with the same complete commitment he gave to everything he decided was important. He brought the baby out to the barn in the mornings when he was old enough to be interested, and talked to him in the same low, steady voice he used with the horses, explaining things. The horses, she had observed, were very calm around the baby because they recognized the tone. The school year of 1884 to 1885 was her 3rd year teaching in Harrow Creek, and by now she was a permanent and central part of the town in the way that good teachers always are. Not just the person who teaches the children, but the person who holds a certain kind of knowledge about every family, who understands where the bright children are, and where the struggling ones are, and where the ones are who need more than arithmetic, who need someone to see them. She had quietly worked with the town council to get better school books. She had written to the state education board about funding. She had organized a lending library with her own books and donations from several families, which lived in a corner of the schoolroom, and which she managed with the orderly attention she gave to anything entrusted to her. The twin boys, their names were Samuel and George Holt, and their father's drinking had not improved, but their circumstances had modestly, because the town quietly arranged work for him that kept him solvent, had become 2 of her best students. Samuel was gifted with numbers. George had a talent for language that she recognized as rare and took seriously. She had written to a school in Austin about a possible scholarship for him when the time came. She told Clayton about this one evening, and he listened and then said, "Write the letter. I will pay the postage." "It may come to more than postage eventually," she said. "Write the letter," he said again. This was who he was now. This was the full form of what she had seen in pieces from the beginning. A man of real generosity operating under the cover of practicality. A man who helped in the language of action because that was the truest language he had. A man who had just needed someone to plant something beautiful on his fence line before he could remember that he had always, underneath everything, been the kind of man who would not pull a single bloom. In the summer of 1885, they had a drought that tested everyone. The creek ran low and the grass dried out, and Clayton spent long, exhausting weeks managing the cattle herd, moving them to better pasture, hauling water, making the 100 daily decisions of a rancher in a dry year. She managed the house and the garden, and the school's summer preparation, and William, who was 8 months old, and had recently discovered the profound joy of pulling himself upright on anything he could reach. She kept her roses watered from the household pump, hauling the bucket faithfully in the early morning and the evening, which was the only time the heat was bearable for that work. Clayton saw her doing it one morning and said nothing, but by the following afternoon There was a second pump outlet closer to the fence line that he had installed while she was teaching, and she came home and found it and stood there for a moment, and then went inside and was very glad that the kitchen was empty for a few minutes. They came through the drought. September brought rain and the grass came back, and by October the creek was running properly, and the land had recovered with the resilience of land that has been through worse. It was a good fall after a hard summer, the air clean and cool and the cottonwoods going gold again, and Winifred felt the deep, particular gratitude of someone who has earned good weather. On a Saturday evening in October she stood on her porch, their porch now, the house that had been his and was theirs, with the addition he had built and the roses climbing the west wall and her books on his shelves, and she looked at the fence line where her roses grew, the full long row of them, 12 plants in their third year and fully established, the deep-rooted damask kind that lived for decades if you gave them what they needed. The blooms were done for the season now, the plants showing their rose hips, red-orange against the silver fence rail in the late afternoon light. Clayton came up behind her and stood at her shoulder. William was inside asleep, down for his afternoon nap with the thoroughness of a baby who had spent the morning pulling himself upright on the fence rail and had exhausted himself. "What are you looking at?" he said. "The fence line," she said. He looked at it with her. The old silver fence rail that ran the full 100 yards of their shared border, and along it the roses, fully established, deep-rooted, not going anywhere. "I should have planted something when I first put the fence in," he said. "Something worthwhile." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the fence line with an expression that was, she recognized, a kind of wonder, the particular wonder of a man who has lived in one way for a long time and is looking back at it from the other side. "You were waiting," she said. He looked at her. "I did not know I was waiting." "That is usually how it works," she said. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch together in the October light, looking at the roses along the fence, and the sky was wide and pink, and the land ran out in every direction as far as the eye could reach, and it was all, she thought, exactly as it should be. The years that followed laid themselves down in the deep, reliable rhythm of a life built well. William walked at 13 months and ran at 14, and talked at 18 months in the thoughtful, selective manner of a child, who had clearly inherited his father's relationship with language few words, each one chosen. By the time he was 2, he could name every horse in his father's barn, and had a particular attachment to a paint mare named Rosie, which Clayton had bought in the spring of 1886, and which William considered personally his, a view the mare seemed to have no objection to. In the fall of 1886, Winifred found she was expecting again. This time she told Clayton while they were both outside, her tending the roses in the September warmth and him repairing a bit of fence at the far end of the property. She walked the length of the fence line to where he was working and waited until he looked up and told him, and he set down his tools and came to her in 3 long strides and held her with the particular quality of held breath in him that was his version of everything he felt most deeply. "A brother for William," he said, "or a sister. Either would suit me," she said. "Either would suit me," he said. Their second child was a girl, born in the spring of 1887, in the same early morning hours that seemed to be the family's preference. They named her Clara, after Winifred's mother, and she arrived with a direct and interested gaze and a calm that suggested someone who had arrived knowing exactly where they were going. Clayton held her the same way he had held William, with that same wonder, present and total, and William, now 2½ and in full possession of opinions, inspected his sister with the careful assessment of someone who is reserving judgment, and then declared her acceptable, which was more than enough. Clara grew into a bright, observant child who had her mother's eye for growing things and her father's economy with words, a combination that made her seem, from very young, as though she was constantly taking notes. She followed Winifred to the garden before she was old enough to help and stood watching the way she watered and pruned with the focused attention of a student, and by 3, She could be trusted with the small watering can to do the section of herbs near the house herself. William, by contrast, was becoming unmistakably a rancher's son. At 5 years old, he was following his father through the barn with the concentrated attention of an apprentice, learning the names of tools and the uses of things, and the particular skills of working stock. Clayton taught him patiently and completely, with the care of a man who understood that the handing down of knowledge was one of the serious responsibilities of a life. He taught him to ride properly at 4, not just to sit on the horse, but to ride it, to communicate with it, to be responsible to it. Winifred watched them from the porch on Saturday mornings, Clayton on his roan and William on his paint mare, walking and then trotting and then, eventually, running. And the particular pride of watching your child learn something real and watching your husband be the teacher was a compound emotion she had no word for but could feel in every part of herself. The school changed and grew. By 1887, Harrow Creek's population had grown enough that the school board agreed to hire a second teacher for the younger children, a young woman named Miss Cassidy from Fredericksburg, fresh out of the normal school in Austin, and full of energy and good ideas. Winifred took her under her wing with the thoroughness she gave to anything she was responsible for, and Miss Cassidy, who was 22 and perceptive, watched her mentor with the admiring attention of someone recognizing that they were in the presence of someone who had figured something out. "How did you know this was the right place?" Miss Cassidy asked once, on a Thursday afternoon when they were sorting books after school. "I did not know," Winifred said. "I trusted it." George Holt, the twin boy with the language talent, he was 16 by then, taller than his brother by 2 inches and possessed of a serious, gentle quality that had clarified over the years, received a scholarship letter from the Austin School in the spring of 1888. Winifred read it twice and then sat down. She had written those letters faithfully for 2 years, updating the school on George's progress, sending his written compositions, advocating with the clear and specific language of someone who knew exactly what she was asking for and why. She brought the letter to Clayton that evening, and he read it and looked up at her and said, "Good." Just that. But good, when Clayton Sheridan said it, contained a great deal. She went to the Holt family herself to bring them the news. Samuel and George's mother, a thin, patient woman named Ruth who had built a life around managing what she could manage and accepting what she could not, sat at her kitchen table and held the letter, and her hands were shaking. "He can go to Austin," Winifred said. "The scholarship covers the fees and room and board. I have written to a family I know of who can provide honest work for his evenings and weekends." Ruth Holt looked up at her with eyes that were doing something very complicated. "Why did you do all this?" she said. "Because George Holt is one of the best minds I have taught," Winifred said simply. "And a mind like that deserves the room it needs." She went home and found Clayton in the kitchen, cooking supper, William at the table with a piece of wood he was whittling under his father's guidance, Clara on the floor with a collection of smooth stones she was arranging with great seriousness. The ordinary domestic scene of a Tuesday evening in October 1888, the kitchen smelling of coffee and supper and wood smoke, the children occupied and the man she loved at the stove. She stood in the doorway and looked at it. Clayton turned around, spatula in hand, and looked at her. "Good news," he said. "Very good news," she said. "All of it." He gave her a look, that particular look she had come to know over 5 years of marriage, the one that held everything he felt for her in the plain gray-green clarity of his eyes, and she came inside and let the warmth of the kitchen close around her. William looked up from his whittling. "Mama," he said, in the considered way of a 5-year-old who has decided to say something, "Papa says I can help with the calving come spring." "Does he?" she said. "He does," Clayton said, "if he pays attention and does what he is told." "I will," William said, with the fervent certainty of someone making a promise they intend absolutely to keep. Clara rearranged her stones and said nothing, which was her standard response to announcements, and which at 3 years old already had a quality of assessment that made Winifred recognize her own younger self in it with startling clarity. The spring of 1889 brought calves and wildflowers and Winifred's roses into their 7th year, which was the year that damask roses, properly established and tended, were coming into their full force. They had spread along the fence line from the original 12 plants into a continuous dense row of them, and in the late spring when they bloomed the scent carried clear across both properties and the road beyond, and travelers on the road sometimes stopped to look at them. One afternoon in May, Winifred was in her garden when a man came along the road in a wagon, a stranger passing through, with the look of someone heading west. He stopped his wagon and leaned down and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. Are those roses?" "They are," she said. "My wife used to grow roses," he said with the past tense that told its own story. He looked at them for a moment. "They are beautiful." "Thank you," she said. He drove on. She watched him go with the particular empathy of someone who understood exactly what it meant to miss something beautiful, and she felt the roses behind her in full bloom, and she felt the whole of her life around her, and she was grateful in the way you are grateful when you have lost things and found things and understand the difference. She turned and found Clayton leaning on the fence behind her, watching. He had come quietly in the way he had. She had never quite cured him of the ability to appear without announcing himself, though after 8 years as her husband she no longer startled. "How long have you been there?" she said. "Long enough," he said. She came to the fence. He was on his side, she was on hers, and the roses were between them, and she looked up at him in the late afternoon light with the full, settled warmth of a woman who has found her person and knows it. "You have never pulled a single one," she said. He looked at the roses. He looked at her. "No," he said, "I have not." "Why not?" she said, even though she knew. She asked because she wanted to hear him say it. He was quiet for a moment in the way that was not evasion but thought, the genuine turning over of how to put a true thing into words. "Because you planted them," he said. "Because they were yours, because they were growing." He paused. "Because I had a fence line that had been empty for 12 years and it did not know what it was missing." She reached across the fence rail and took his hand, the way he had taken hers that morning in March 4 years ago when she had told him she knew about the storm, and held it. "Clayton," she said. "Winifred," he said. William came running from the direction of the barn at a dead run, yelling something about a foal, which was the news that the sorrel mare they had been watching had finally gone into labor, which meant the next several hours were going to involve a great deal of attention to the barn, and very little of anything else. And Clara appeared on the porch calling for her mama in the imperious tone of a 3-year-old who wanted something she had not yet specified. The quiet moment, as quiet moments do, dissolved into the full, warm noise of living. Winifred laughed and squeezed Clayton's hand and released it and went to see what Clara needed. He watched her go and then went to his barn, walking with the easy stride of a man in his full place. And the foal was born just before sundown, healthy and glossy. A little bay filly that William immediately, and without consultation, named her Rosie too, which Clayton accepted with the patient dignity of a father who understood that some battles were not worth fighting. That evening, after supper, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, they sat together on the porch as they often did in the warm months, side by side in the 2 chairs he had built when they were first married, made from the same cedar as the fence rails, low and solid, and built to last. The sky was full of stars. The roses along the fence were invisible in the dark, but their scent was everywhere. He was reading. She was reading. They were not talking because they did not need to. There was a word for what had grown between them over these years. Not passion only, not comfort only, but something built from both. Something made of the daily specific weight of one person's presence in another person's life. The meals and the arguments and the laughter and the hard seasons, and the good ones and the children sleeping inside, and the horses quiet in the barn and the roses along the fence, and the man who had learned to look at beauty, and the woman who had kept planting it until he did. She looked over at him. He was frowning slightly at whatever he was reading. He always frowned slightly when he read, not from displeasure, but from the same deep attention he gave to everything. There was gray at his temples now, the first silver in his dark hair, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had deepened from years of squinting into the Texas sun. He was 39 years old, and he looked like a man who had been fully used by the life he lived, which was the most respectable thing you could look like. He felt her looking and glanced up. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I am just looking at you." "Any particular reason?" he said. "I like looking at you," she said. He held her gaze for a moment and then went back to his reading, but the corner of his mouth had moved, and she saw it, and she turned back to her own book with a satisfaction so complete it had almost no weight to it. In 1890, when the new decade came in clean and cool, Winifred Leland Sheridan was 39 years old, still the schoolteacher of Harrow Creek, the mother of 2 children, and expecting a third by summer, and the woman who had turned 100 yards of poor fence-lined soil into the most beautiful mile of road in the county. She had made something out of nothing with her hands and her patience and her absolute certainty that beauty was not extra, that it was necessary, that it was in fact the thing that held everything else together the way good soil holds good roots. And Clayton Sheridan, who was 41 years old and had been in full possession of his efficient, undecorated, well-ordered life for as long as anyone in Harrow Creek could remember, ran his cattle and maintained his fences and built and fixed and worked with the same focused competence he had always had, and was also now a man who knew the names of 12 varieties of roses, who had a wife whose laugh he had memorized the same way he had memorized every contour of his land, and who had 2 children who would grow up knowing that beauty was worth tending, that a fence line could hold roses, and that the most useful thing in the world was sometimes the thing you had not thought to plant, until someone came along and showed you. Their 3rd child was born in July of 1890, another son, whom they named James, after nobody in particular except that it was a good, solid name that suited the round-faced, rosy-cheeked, enormous-lunged baby who arrived in the middle of a summer evening, while Clayton paced the porch in a manner that Winifred, who could hear him from the bedroom, found deeply endearing. When Mrs. Frey brought the baby out and put him in Clayton's arms, Clayton stood very still, the way he had stood with William and Clara, and said hello to his son in his low and steady voice. William, now 6, craned his neck from where he sat on the porch steps to see. Clara, 4, stood at her father's elbow and inspected the baby with the particular scrutiny of a child who is maintaining her position as the youngest girl in the family with a dignity she has decided requires acknowledgement. "He is very pink," Clara said. "You were very pink," Clayton told her. "I was not this pink," Clara said firmly. "You were exactly this pink," he said. She considered this. "All right," she said. "He can stay." Winifred heard this from inside the bedroom and laughed, weak and warm and completely happy, and Mrs. Frey shook her head and smiled. August found them settled into the new rhythm of 3 children, which was louder and more complicated and entirely full. There was never a quiet moment in the house now that was not deliberately found, but the fullness was the good kind, the kind that is density rather than weight, and Winifred and Clayton had by now the long-married quality of people who can communicate in shorthand and who carry each other through the hard days without requiring explanation. The roses were magnificent that year. The established plants were enormous now, the canes thick and arching over the fence rail, the blooms in June so heavy and so fragrant that the whole road smelled of them for 3 weeks. Travelers commented. Mrs. Boatwright, who had been saying for years that Winifred Leland was the best thing that had happened to Harrow Creek, added, "And those roses along the Sheridan fence line are the best thing that has happened to this road." On a morning in September, with the summer heat beginning to ease and the first suggestion of fall in the air, Winifred went out early to tend her roses in the new light, the same task she had been doing for 8 years in this place, and she crouched along the fence line, checking the soil and the canes and the new growth. And she felt the deep, quiet satisfaction of tending something you have built over years, something that has survived hard weather and come back stronger. She heard the gate behind her, Clayton coming through from the barn side, which he rarely did, this side of the fence being her domain, and she turned to find him standing there in the early morning with his coffee cup, looking at the roses. "You are on my side of the fence," she said. "I am," he agreed. He looked down the length of the roses, the full long row of them, 7 years old and fully alive. "I wanted to look at them from this side." She stood up and came to stand beside him. They looked at the roses together from her side of the fence, which was a view he had not had before, the plants between them and the fence and his land rolling out beyond. "They are better from here," he said. "Everything looks different from a different vantage," she said. He put his arm around her there in the early morning in the scent of the roses, and she leaned into him with the ease of long familiarity and deep love. James would be awake soon and wanting to be fed, and William had to be ready for school, and Clara would have opinions about her breakfast that she would express at length, and the day would begin in its full and noisy way, and there was not a part of it she would have traded. "Winifred," he said. "Clayton," she said. "I am glad you planted them," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the roses, not at her, but she could see his profile and the lines of his face, familiar as her own hands by now, and she understood that he was not talking only about the roses, had never been talking only about the roses. "So am I," she said. She took his hand and they stood together in the September morning on her side of the fence, with the roses between them and the whole of their life on both sides of it, and the land ran out wide and open in every direction under the big Texas sky, and it was more than enough, and it was everything, and it would last.